November 28th, 1950. The White House. Harry S. Truman sat at his desk in the Oval Office, staring at the intelligence report that had just been delivered by the CIA. The words seemed to blur on the page, but their meaning was crystal clear and absolutely catastrophic. Chinese Communist forces. Estimated 300,000 troops now engaged in North Korea. 300,000. The number was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Just weeks ago, General Douglas MacArthur had assured him that the Chinese wouldn't intervene in Korea. MacArthur had said the war was nearly won, that American troops would be home by Christmas, that the United Nations forces would reunify Korea under a democratic government. MacArthur had been so confident, so certain, so dismissive of any warnings about Chinese intervention. And now, 300,000 Chinese soldiers were pouring across the Yalu River, attacking American and UN forces, threatening to turn a nearly won victory into a catastrophic defeat. Truman felt a cold fury building inside him. This was a disaster. This was exactly what he had feared when he had authorized MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel and advance toward the Chinese border. He had warned MacArthur to be cautious, to avoid provoking the Chinese, to have a plan in case China intervened. But MacArthur had ignored those warnings. MacArthur had pushed forward recklessly, dividing his forces, advancing on multiple axes, getting closer and closer to the Chinese border, until finally the Chinese had had enough. And now American soldiers were dying. UN forces were retreating in chaos. The entire Korean War, which had seemed nearly won just weeks ago, was suddenly in jeopardy. And Truman was the one who would have to explain to the American people how this had happened, how a war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had suddenly become a potential catastrophe. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, entered the Oval Office, his face grim. "Mr. President, we need to talk about Korea." Truman looked up, his jaw tight. 300,000 Chinese troops, Dean. 300,000. How the hell did we not see this coming? Acheson sat down heavily. The intelligence was there, Mr. President, but it was fragmentary, contradictory. MacArthur's intelligence chief, General Willoughby, kept insisting the Chinese wouldn't intervene in force. He estimated maybe 60,000 to 70,000 troops at most. Even when we started getting reports of massive Chinese movements across the Yalu, Willoughby dismissed them. Truman slammed his hand on the desk. Willoughby was wrong. MacArthur was wrong. I was told this war was nearly over. I was told the Chinese were bluffing. I was told our boys would be home for Christmas. And now we've got 300,000 Chinese soldiers attacking our forces, and we're in danger of losing everything we've gained. Acheson said carefully, "Mr. President, we need to make some decisions. First, do we continue the offensive, or do we pull back? Second, how do we respond to Chinese intervention? Do we expand the war to China itself, or do we limit our response to Korea? And third, what do we do about MacArthur?" Truman stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the White House grounds. It was late November, cold and gray. The trees were bare. Winter was coming, and in Korea, winter was brutal. Temperatures dropping to 30 below zero, snow and ice making movement difficult, soldiers freezing to death in their foxholes. His boys were out there, American soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, fighting and dying in the frozen mountains of North Korea. They had been told they were winning, that the war was almost over, that they'd be home soon. And now they were surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, fighting for their lives, retreating through mountain passes in sub-zero temperatures. Truman thought about World War II, about the terrible decisions he had made, the decision to use the atomic bomb, the decision to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from Japan. Those had been agonizing choices, but they had been clear. The stakes had been obvious. The path forward had been difficult but comprehensible. This was different. This was a limited war, a police action, as he had called it, designed to stop communist aggression in Korea without triggering World War III. But now, China had intervened with massive force, and the war was no longer limited. It was expanding, escalating, threatening to become exactly the kind of global conflict he had been trying to avoid. "What are MacArthur's recommendations?" Truman asked, still looking out the window. Acheson consulted his notes. "MacArthur wants to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria. He wants to blockade the Chinese coast. He wants to use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to open a second front against mainland China. In short, he wants to expand the war to China itself." Truman turned around sharply. "That's insane. If we attack China directly, the Soviets will have to respond. We'll have World War III. We'll have nuclear war. Everything we've been trying to avoid for the past 5 years will happen." Acheson nodded. "I agree, Mr. President. Expanding the war to China would be catastrophic. We need to contain this conflict to Korea, even if that means accepting a less than total victory." Truman walked back to his desk and sat down. "Then we need to make that clear to MacArthur. We're not expanding this war. We're not attacking China. We're going to fight in Korea. We're going to defend our positions, but we're not going to start World War III. General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was ushered into the Oval Office. Truman immediately asked him, "Omar, what's the situation on the ground?" Bradley's face was grave. "Not good, Mr. President. The Chinese attacked in overwhelming force. They hit us at multiple points, using human wave tactics, attacking at night, using bugles and whistles to coordinate their movements. Our forces were caught by surprise. MacArthur had divided his command. The 8th Army on the west, X-Corps on the east, with a gap in between. The Chinese exploited that gap. They're threatening to encircle our forces." Truman felt his stomach tighten. "Are we in danger of losing the entire army?" Bradley hesitated. "It's possible, Mr. President. If the Chinese can cut off our retreat routes, if they can surround our forces, yes, we could face a catastrophic defeat. We could lose tens of thousands of men." The room fell silent. The implications were staggering. An American army surrounded and destroyed in Korea. Tens of thousands of American soldiers killed or captured. The greatest military defeat in American history since the Civil War. And it would be Truman's responsibility. His decision to intervene in Korea. His decision to authorize MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel. His decision to push toward the Chinese border. "What do we need to do?" Truman asked quietly. Bradley said, "We need to order an immediate retreat, pull back to defensible positions, consolidate our forces, establish a line we can hold. And we need to do it now, before the Chinese can complete their encirclement." Truman nodded. "Do it. Order MacArthur to pull back. Save the army. That's the priority now. Save our boys." After Bradley left, Truman sat alone with Acheson. The Secretary of State could see the weight pressing down on the President. Truman looked older suddenly, more tired, more burdened. "This is my fault," Truman said quietly. "I authorized the crossing of the 38th parallel. I let MacArthur convince me that we could reunify Korea. I ignored the warnings about Chinese intervention, and now our boys are paying the price." Acheson said firmly, "Mr. President, you made the best decisions you could with the information you had. MacArthur assured you the Chinese wouldn't intervene. The intelligence was ambiguous. You had every reason to believe we could win this war quickly and decisively." Truman shook his head. "But I should have been more cautious. I should have listened to the warnings. The Chinese sent signals. They said they would intervene if we approached their border. Zhou Enlai said it explicitly through diplomatic channels. But I thought they were bluffing. I thought they wouldn't dare take on the United States." He stood up and began pacing. "Do you know what this means, Dean? This means the Korean War isn't going to end quickly. This means we're in for a long, bloody stalemate. This means thousands more Americans are going to die. This means I'm going to have to go on television and tell the American people that the war they thought was almost over is actually just beginning." Acheson said, "The American people will understand, Mr. President. They know war is unpredictable. They know the Chinese intervention changes everything." Truman stopped pacing and looked at Acheson with a bitter expression. "Will they? Or will they blame me for getting us into this mess? Will they say I should have stayed south of the 38th parallel? Will they say I should have listened to the warnings about China? Will they say I should have fired MacArthur before he got us into this disaster?" It was the first time Truman had explicitly mentioned firing MacArthur, and Acheson understood the significance. The president was starting to think that MacArthur's recklessness, his overconfidence, his dismissal of intelligence warnings had led directly to this catastrophe. "Mr. President," Acheson said carefully, "MacArthur is a national hero. He's the man who defeated Japan, who rebuilt Japan, who orchestrated the Incheon landing. Firing him would be politically explosive." Truman's jaw tightened. "I don't care about the politics. I care about winning this war without starting World War III. And if MacArthur can't follow orders, if he keeps pushing to expand the war to China, then I'll have no choice but to relieve him." That evening, Truman addressed the nation on television and radio. He sat at his desk in the Oval Office, his face serious, his voice steady but somber. "My fellow Americans, I want to talk to you tonight about the situation in Korea. As you know, United Nations forces under General MacArthur have been fighting to repel communist aggression in Korea since last June. We have achieved significant successes. We drove the North Korean invaders out of South Korea. We liberated Seoul. We crossed the 38th parallel and advanced into North Korea." He paused, then continued. "But now the situation has changed dramatically. Communist China has intervened in the war with massive force. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops have crossed into North Korea and are attacking our forces. This is a serious development, and I want to be frank with you about what it means." Truman leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming more intense. "It means that the war in Korea will not end as quickly as we had hoped. It means that we face a long and difficult struggle. It means that more American soldiers will be in danger, that more casualties will occur, that more sacrifices will be required." He continued, "But I want to make one thing absolutely clear. We are not going to abandon Korea. We are not going to let communist aggression succeed. We went into Korea to stop an invasion, to defend a free nation, to show that the United Nations will not tolerate aggression. That mission hasn't changed. Chinese intervention makes it harder, but it doesn't change our fundamental purpose." Then Truman addressed the question that was on everyone's mind. Would the war expand to China itself? Some people are calling for us to expand the war to China, to bomb Chinese cities, to blockade Chinese ports, to attack Chinese territory. I want to be very clear about this. We are not going to do that. We are going to limit this war to Korea. We are not going to start World War III. His voice became firmer, more emphatic. "I know that's frustrating. I know people want to strike back at China for intervening, but we have to think about the larger picture. If we attack China directly, the Soviet Union will be forced to respond. We will have a global war. We will have nuclear war. Millions of people will die. That is not a price I'm willing to pay." Truman then spoke directly to the families of soldiers in Korea. "I know many of you have sons, husbands, brothers, fathers fighting in Korea. I know you're worried about them. I know you're frightened by the news of Chinese intervention. I want you to know that we are doing everything possible to protect our troops, to give them the support they need, to bring them home safely." He concluded, "This is a difficult time for our nation. We face a serious challenge in Korea, but I have faith in the American people. I have faith in our soldiers. I have faith that we will meet this challenge with courage and determination. We will not abandon our principles. We will not give in to aggression. We will defend freedom in Korea, and we will prevail." After the speech, Truman sat in the Oval Office with his closest advisors. The response to the speech had been mixed. Some praised his determination to continue the fight in Korea. Others criticized his refusal to expand the war to China, and many were simply frightened by the prospect of a long, bloody stalemate against Chinese forces. "What do you think MacArthur will do?" Truman asked Bradley. The general shook his head. "I don't know, Mr. President. MacArthur doesn't like being constrained. He believes in total victory, in using all available force to defeat the enemy. Telling him he can't attack China, that he has to fight a limited war, it goes against everything he believes in." Truman said grimly, "Then he'll have to learn. Because I'm the commander-in-chief, and I'm not going to let one general, no matter how famous or accomplished, drag this country into World War III." Over the next few weeks, the situation in Korea deteriorated further. American and UN forces retreated in the face of overwhelming Chinese numbers. The retreat was chaotic, desperate, with soldiers fighting rearguard actions in sub-zero temperatures, trying to avoid encirclement, struggling to maintain unit cohesion as Chinese forces pressed them from all sides. The Marines at the Chosin Reservoir fought one of the most heroic battles in American military history, surrounded by Chinese forces fighting their way out through mountain passes in temperatures of 30 below zero. "Retreat, hell," said one Marine commander. "We're just attacking in a different direction." But heroism couldn't change the fundamental reality. The Chinese intervention had transformed the Korean War from a nearly won victory into a desperate struggle for survival. MacArthur's promise of victory by Christmas had been exposed as a catastrophic miscalculation, and Truman was left to manage the consequences. In his diary, Truman wrote bitterly about MacArthur. "I should have fired him 2 years ago. He's insubordinate, he's reckless, he's more concerned with his own glory than with the lives of his soldiers. But he's a national hero, and firing him would cause a political firestorm. So I'm stuck with him, at least for now." But Truman also wrote about his own responsibility. "I authorized the crossing of the 38th parallel. I let MacArthur convince me we could reunify Korea. I didn't insist on more caution as we approached the Chinese border. This disaster is partly my fault, and I have to live with that. Thousands of American boys are dying because of decisions I made. That's the burden of being president. That's the price of command." Late at night, Truman would sit in the White House residence, unable to sleep, thinking about the soldiers in Korea. He imagined them in the frozen mountains, surrounded by Chinese troops, fighting for their lives, wondering if they would ever see home again. He thought about their families, waiting for news, dreading the telegram that would tell them their loved one had been killed or captured. And he thought about the decision he would soon have to make. The decision about MacArthur, because it was becoming increasingly clear that MacArthur couldn't or wouldn't accept the limitations Truman was placing on the war. MacArthur kept pushing for expansion to China, kept making public statements that contradicted administration policy, kept acting as if he, not the president, was in charge of American foreign policy. Truman knew that eventually he would have to fire MacArthur. It would be politically explosive. It would enrage MacArthur's supporters. It might even cost Truman the presidency. But the alternative, allowing a general to dictate policy, to ignore presidential directives, to risk World War III, was unacceptable. "The Constitution is clear," Truman said to Atchison one evening. "Civilian control of the military. The president is the commander-in-chief, not the generals, not MacArthur. Me. And if MacArthur can't accept that, then he'll have to go." On November 28, 1950, as the full scale of the Chinese intervention became clear, Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office and confronted the greatest crisis of his presidency. 300,000 Chinese troops had entered Korea. American forces were retreating in chaos. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had become a nightmare, and Truman had to find a way to salvage the situation without starting World War III. He thought about what he would say to the soldiers if he could speak to them directly. He would tell them he was sorry for the miscalculations, sorry for the overconfidence, sorry for the suffering they were enduring. He would tell them he was proud of them, proud of their courage and their sacrifice, and he would tell them that their fight was not in vain, that they were defending important principles, that they were standing up to communist aggression, that they were part of a larger struggle for freedom. But mostly, he would tell them to survive, to fight when they had to retreat when they had to do whatever was necessary to stay alive and come home. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not victory or defeat, not territory gained or lost, but the lives of the young men who had been sent to fight a war in a cold, distant land. 300,000 Chinese troops had entered Korea, and Harry Truman had to find a way to deal with the consequences.